Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled NACOE Local Government Heavy Vehicle Route Assessment Guidelines, Amenities, Structures and Pavement. Next slide, please. My name's Isabella and I'll be moderating the session today. Next slide, please. We plan to go for 60 minutes with time for questions. Next slide, please. We'd love to have your input. So you see here on the slide how to send your questions through. Now we are also following the government guidelines and all working from our home offices. So fingers crossed all our technology works. And we also have Neva and Guy from ARRB joining in for technology support. Next slide, please. Our presenter today is Kieran Hay, Senior Professional Engineer, Transport Safety, ARRB. Next slide, please. And we also have 4 guest presenters today who are available for questions throughout. And they are David Milling, Team Leader, Transport Safety, ARRB, Tim Hull, Chief Technology Leader, Future Transport Infrastructure, ARRB, Laurie Neuer, Principal Professional, Road Asset Performance, ARRB, and Larry Griffiths, Principal Engineer, Road Manager Policy, Heavy Vehicles and Prosecutions Department of Transport and Main Roads. Okay, let's get started and we'll be now hearing from Kieran.
Thanks, Isabella. It's great to be back for our final webinar presentation. And like always, I just want to thank all the guest panelists for joining me to answer some of the questions that are a little bit outside my expertise. So thanks everyone for joining. All right. So as most of you should hopefully know, this is the last of the 5-part webinar series aimed at conveying the new guidance presented in the Local Government Heavy Vehicle Route Assessment Guidelines. So yeah, we've hit the final stage here. So this session is going to essentially just cover the amenities, structures and pavement sections of the guide. In some of these sections, we'll kind of breeze through them a little bit quickly, and others will take a little bit more time depending on the amount of content that's been added to the guide. So again, this slide just shows a quick overview of what sections in the guidelines we'll be covering in this webinar session. Each of these sections has some new guidance in them in comparison to some of the existing guides. And during this webinar, we'll be touching on each of these sections. So the key additions that have been covered or have been added to the guide is the updated guidance on amenity considerations, the incorporation of a structures assessment framework into the guide, and the incorporation of a pavement assessments process into the guide as well. And we'll be looking at each of those shortly. So we're going to start off with the amenity considerations. So there's been some minor updates to the guidance of amenity considerations. So if you've used some of the older route assessment guidelines or even some of the existing route assessment guidelines, you may have already seen these before. So these provide more focus in this guide. So the amenities are broken down into 6 main areas. So we've got adjacent land use, noise, emissions and odors, airborne dust and water splash/spray, seasonality, and off-street parking. So these considerations look at the impact of heavy vehicles on the surrounding area of a network or a route that's being requested for access. And the primary considerations that have been identified are noise, exhaust emissions, and airborne dust. So we'll go through each of these and have a look in a little bit more detail. I think in this instance, there's not a lot of content around the off-street parking, but yeah. So the adjacent land use. So considerations for adjacent land use needs to be given in order to minimize the heavy vehicle conflict in areas adjacent to special land use types. So these special land use types include schools, hospitals, aged care facilities, wildlife corridors, and shopping centres. So obviously you don't really want to have heavy vehicles travelling down some of these areas or around these areas. And the goal of this is, just to prevent conflict between those vehicles and the surrounding areas. It's also to increase productivity and meet social needs. So that's the purpose of having this in there, and the purpose of land use planning as well. So the second amenity consideration is noise. So noise considerations are fairly straightforward, but are a critical concern when providing access for heavy vehicles. So obviously heavy vehicles generate significantly more noise than other vehicle types. And I've provided a nice little figure there on the right to kind of demonstrate this a little bit, where the rings are kind of like the level of noise and also the distance that noise travels. So you can see that heavy vehicles do produce a significantly greater amount. So this probably isn't to scale, but it gives a good idea on what the effect is. So the increase in noise really needs to be considered in areas sensitive to road traffic noise. So that includes those special land areas that we were talking about previously. So things like schools, hospitals, residential areas, aged care facilities, anything like that. So that's where you really need to be looking into that. So factors contributing to noise generation really need to be considered, and mitigation factors can be used to kind of eliminate noise in certain areas. And yeah, those mitigation of noise should really be considered in the process of assessing a route. And yeah, so then we come to the fantastic one, emissions and odors. So heavy vehicles produce more exhaust emissions compared to passenger vehicles. And then also vehicles such as livestock carriers can produce undesirable odors. So if you've ever driven behind a livestock carrier, you'll probably know what we're talking about here. So consideration to occupants of sensitive facilities should be given, and the potential impact should also be investigated. Yeah, and the guide covers off a bit more information on that as well. So airborne dust and water splash and spray. So some general guidance has been provided on this, depending on the vehicle types, posted speed limits and AADTs. So heavy vehicles can produce significantly more airborne dust and water splash. And these factors can adversely affect other vehicles that are operating in that area. So you can see in the photo on the bottom right there that that airborne dust is kind of traveling out in a wider arc around behind the vehicle. So it's not just vehicles behind, but it's also vehicles to the side, or even pedestrians or cyclists to the side that can get affected by that. So when you're assessing a route for heavy vehicles, you should be considering the distance to buildings and their use, the likely number of heavy vehicles, the likelihood of significant amounts of dust, splash or spray, and also any mitigation options that can be put in place to kind of eliminate that to some degree. And in the guide, we've also provided that table 11.1 in the top right there, that kind of provides a general overview of when roads should be sealed in regards to dust and splash and spray. So as an example, for a B-double vehicle where the posted speed limit's, let's say, less than 80 kilometers per hour, and doesn't really matter what the AADT is in this case, the road should be sealed, preferably with a sealed shoulder, though an unsealed shoulder is acceptable. And there's a bit more guidance on that in the actual guideline itself, so I definitely recommend checking that out. And yeah, finally, seasonality. So fluctuations in traffic are expected during holiday periods and also harvest seasons. And there's a lot of other times where where the traffic can fluctuate as well. So if there's big events happening in certain towns or cities, that can cause influxes of traffic as well. But you really need to consider if heavy vehicles have the potential to disrupt that regular operation. And at the same time, you should be considering economic benefits of providing that approval, the number of heavy vehicles and the risks that are involved with that, and then also mitigation options. And yeah, so we can see up in the top right, I've kind of provided a little bit of an example of that. So this is just a weekly pattern across the whole year. And it shows that there are those spikes in traffic in certain areas. So in this case, it's June, July period, while it drops off in the January period. So you need to be looking at whether heavy vehicles will be causing issues, especially around that peak traffic area, peak traffic time. And I also did mention parking or off-street parking suitability. So most of that guidance is contained in external documents, and the guidelines will actually reference you to that. So we didn't provide much content on that in these slides, at least. All right, so I'll just stop there quickly for any questions that have come through. I know that was a bit of a quick overview of amenities, but there is some new guidance in there, and it was worth just pointing out that that guidance is there. So I'll just take some quick questions before we look at some of the structural framework side of things.
Thanks,
Isabella?
Kieran. Yeah, we've got a question from Belinda, and they have asked, how much can noise, dust, etc. be taken into account really? A 19-metre heavy vehicle can travel wherever it wants unless there's a sign saying it can't. Will increasing the length of 20 to 23 or 25 metres have that much more impact?
Yeah, so larger vehicles typically do have a greater impact on dust and noise. Obviously, you've got more wheels on the ground, so that's more areas that can kick up that dust. It's a bit hard to really quantify a certain amount of dust that is kicked up, but yeah, if you do look at any sort of vehicle trials on unsealed roads, typically you can see a difference between a 19-metre vehicle and something like a Type 1 road train. The level of difference is quite significant. But yeah, like I said, you can't really quantify it very easily. So it is a bit of a subjective thing on how much dust is acceptable, I suppose.
Thanks, Kieran. We've got another question from Cameron, and they have asked 10,000 VPD is a high threshold for sealing for PBS to traffic. I would think there should be a lower threshold for sealing / not sealing. Please comment.
Yeah, so this one I may have to push over to Dave. He'd probably be able to provide a bit more information on that. I'll just jump back to that slide there as a bit of a helping hand.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I might provide a short answer and then perhaps ask Laurie for a little bit more of an extended answer. So the short answer is the table it's a recommendation for specifically managing dust, splash and spray, not strictly a trigger to seal a road, but it is there just to identify how you can manage those risks. So if we think back to the formation width criteria, the criteria does recognise lower volume roads can be unsealed, and we've provided guidance for that throughout the guide. It's really just thinking about overtaking vehicles traveling in the opposite direction, and then also to the environmental effects of producing that level of dust. Laurie, are you able to perhaps provide anything that maybe be outside the guide with regards to consideration for dust suppression and sealing a road?
Sure, Dave. Kieran, thanks. The one at a time, if you're talking about sealing an unsealed road, it's usually the factors that is economic. So there has been a recent study done in that area specifically, and if a ballpark figure is usually around 200 vehicles a day, that's when you start considering to seal your unsealed roads. It all depends on how much the upfront costs you need to put in to make the economic works, I suppose. If you're on the hilly area, obviously you're gonna need to put in more works, and that 200 per day vehicle becomes not economic. So that's just a ballpark figures. Dust is always a hard one. There's no silver bullet when it comes to this, especially when you're in a dry season. The best advice that I usually give to people is compaction with water. If you do it properly, you would stretch your unsealed road from being dusty a bit longer. But if you're right in the middle of dry season, some of the chemical or stabilization agents can help, but then again, the quality varies. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Laurie and Dave, for that.
Perfect, Kieran. We've got another question, and this has come from Kevin. And they have asked, how was the percentage AADT determined?
I'm not sure I understand that. Yeah, you probably won't be able to ask them, but
that's all right, Kieran. We can ask Kevin to re-ask the question in the question box and can always come back to it.
Yeah, I might just have to get him to provide a little bit more detail just to work out exactly what he's referring to. I think he might be referring to this seasonality, but I just want to double check before I go providing any answers. That's all.
No worries. We'll move on to one more question, and this has come from Mohammed. And they have asked, what is the offset distance of traffic noise of HV along the road corridor? Any guidance, please, in road design?
Yes, I might just pass that one through to Dave. He'd probably be able to provide a bit better information.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, look, there's definitely some guidance around in a few publications. I might take advantage of having Larry in the call and just ask how TMR are handling this at the moment and what documentation they provide that covers this issue.
I'm going to have to come back to you on that one. I don't have any of that documentation to hand, but I can look into it and get back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And I guess that's something that we can answer in the questions. I can't remember off the top of my head either, but there is advice around that. For example, TMR has their own acoustics team that do have all this sort of information, and they use that to develop noise barriers, heights and designs and offsets and warrants for when they're provided. So the information is around. So we'll look into it and get back to you.
Thanks, Dave. All right, I think maybe we should move on to the next section, and yeah, we can answer some more questions later. I've got a few more question sections in here, so yeah, feel free to keep sending them in. All right. So the next section that we're going to be looking at is the structures assessment part, and the guide itself doesn't really tell you, the fine intricacies of undertaking a structural assessment. It's more providing a framework on when to do the assessment and in what stages you should do it. So yeah, so this part will be relatively brief, but we do have Tim Helt here, so he can provide a bit more information if anyone has any questions. But yeah, so let's get started. So as a general overview, there's two fundamental activities. So it's network classification, so what is the capacity of the structures on the network, and then also access decision making. So can a given vehicle travel on that structure? So with network classification, it's all about asset knowledge, really. So where are your assets? What's the design loading, as-built records, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not going to really touch too much on that part. It's just as a bit of a FYI for everyone. So the classification process. So most common situations encountered. So for when you have a full set of plans, no defects, review of plans, quantifiable structural defects or desktop modeling, and then when you don't have plans. So it's a bit of a mixed bag on that one. And again, like this is just a bit of background information on that, just to provide some information in here. There's some more guidance in the actual guideline itself, but yeah, we don't want to get too much into the detail here, otherwise it'll go from about a 1 hour webinar to a 6 hour webinar, that's all. Yeah, so this is probably getting more into the framework side of things. So this is a comparison of the different assessment tiers that are out there, and you can see here that there's 3 different assessment tiers for structures. So we've got NHVR's assessment tiers, which is tier 1 to 3. We've got the TMR assessment tiers, which is tier 0 to 2, and then the Austroads assessment tiers, which is tier 1 to 3 as well. But they are all slightly different. So that is something that should be taken to note. So within this guide, we've stuck to the TMR assessment tiers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But basically, you've got the tier 0 to 2, where tier 0 is a line model comparison of load effects. Tier 1 is using structural engineering principles in comparing capacity to vehicle load effect. And then tier 2 is refined analysis using a wide range of activities. So this is including advanced analysis methods, finite element analysis, load testing, site-specific load models, etc. And I think I've got a little bit more detail on that shortly. So this is our overall framework that's being provided in the guideline, and it's just a simple flowchart to assist in undertaking the assessment of structures. So it kind of helps you to know when certain assessment types should be used and when you should move on to a different assessment type. Yeah, so you can see in the figure on the right there that it's looking at collating all your available information, asks you whether you know what the condition of that bridge is. So then if it's a no, you do level 2 inspection. If it's a yes, you go on to a tier 1 assessment, or you are asked if a previous tier 1 assessment has been undertaken. So it kind of just guides you through that process. And again, so this is looking at the TMR model of assessment tiers, just providing a little bit more information into that. So as I mentioned before, tier 0 is kind of like the simplest method available, where you're comparing design vehicle load effects, and it can typically be performed in-house with limited bridge design or assessment experience. And in a lot of cases, it's a very conservative analysis. And then you move on to your tier 1 assessment. So that's comparing the capacity to the vehicle load effect. So this requires bridge design or assessment experience and appropriate software to be able to do that. So it's less conservative, but more accurate. And then finally, you've got your tier 2 assessment. So this is used in special cases where we have a plausibility gap, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And typically complex modeling or testing is required, and components or load effects specific, and it should be highly accurate as to what is the capacity of the bridge. And we'll just kind of like show a little bit more information on each of those tiers. So back to the tier 0 here. So as I said before, it's a bit of a line beam model to determine load effects, and you don't really need a lot of structural knowledge to kind of put this into place. So it's essentially a formula. So we've got that at the top there, where it's the peak design vehicle effect over the peak application vehicle effect. So the vehicle effect should include bending moment, shear force, and support reactions. And yeah, so it does require knowledge of the design, loading, or existing legally loaded vehicles traveling on the bridge. and engineering judgment is required to take into account existing condition of the structure. And then you move on to your tier 1 here. So this typically uses like a 2D or 3D computer models to really understand the effects on that bridge and the capacity of the bridge. So concessions can be applied in the analysis, so things like travel restrictions, and the results can be reused for future application assessments. And again, so structural engineering isn't my expertise, so that's why we've got Tim in here. If anyone has a bit more, if anyone wants a bit more information about this. So again, the tier 1 assessment ratio. So it's basically the oh God, I've just blanked on what ULS means. It's the available ultimate limit state capacity for live load effects over the ultimate limit state load effect by application and accompanying vehicles. Yeah. And then finally, you've got your tier 2 assessment. So this is a bit of an advanced process undertaken when the tier 1 assessment kind of indicates that there's a theoretical structural deficiency, yet observed performance does not confirm this. And it typically involves like a robust assessment criteria, is not typically performed at the local jurisdiction level. So it is quite a complex and costly analysis, and a lot of technical oversight is kind of required in that process. So the general guide is to really complete steps C to G from the AS 51000.7. So that's your load rating methods. So I'll just open up for some questions there. As I said before, structural assessment definitely isn't my area of expertise, and that's why we've got Tim in here to kind of provide a bit more information. So Isabella, is there any questions that have come through?
Yeah, we've got a question from Paul, and they have asked, there are so many new truck types to consider and our old ratings may not considered. Should the applicant be charged for a new assessment? Should there be a new bridge rating system that covers all the different truck load types?
So with the part about charging the applicant, I suppose that's kind of up to you really. I know in the HBNL there is a clause that allows you to kind of put the onus back on the applicant. But yeah, in the end, that's really the local government's decision on how they approach that and whether the applicant is willing to undertake that assessment on their own accord. In regards to the rest of that question, I may have to pass over to Tim. Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. What I might do is just take a step back for a minute and paint a bit of a picture, because there's a lot of confusion in the industry about heavy vehicle assessment versus structural assessment. And if I could put it this way, what do they have in common? Well, they both use engineering mechanics, so that's kind of good news. But they're actually very different in terms of the decision types that come with them. So heavy vehicle assessments, you need to be fast, definitive, and cheap. That's the characteristics of those decisions. Whereas a structural assessment is typically so slow, complex, and expensive. And so the link between those two things, for most practical purpose, is a line model. So line models are something a structural engineer can use to do structural assessments, but in this situation, line models are really the comparison tool that you would ideally have within your organisation. So what that should allow you to do, and it speaks a little bit to the heart of the question there around different vehicle types. So if you've got, if your organisation's got a line model tool with, if you like, the limits of each asset defined by, some line model criteria, all you're really then doing with any vehicle that that you're getting asked to assess their access is really comparing, well, how does that vehicle compare to the other reference vehicles which we know are okay? And that's essentially, that's what you're really trying to do. And if you've got that tool, then, you know, if the tool's half decent, it pretty much shouldn't matter what type of vehicle configuration gets thrown at you within bounds, and I'll come back to that, because it should be a fairly straightforward exercise. You stick it in, have a look, and it either passes or fails. Where that comes unstuck, so that's okay for general freight vehicles, but line model comparisons are pretty challenged if you start talking oversize, over mass permit type vehicles. So that from a, you kind of split once you get to that point. So going back to the question though, if you've got a line model tool that's half decent, then it shouldn't matter too much what, you know, different vehicle configurations and masses, because you should have a reference vehicle in your library, essentially, that establishes the structural criteria that allows you to do that comparison. The other thing I'd say is that once you start looking at the structural assessment, so if you've got a line model tool and you're not a structural engineer, provided a structural engineer has been involved in building the line model tool, you can be pretty happy about doing the comparison and providing decisions and moving on. I would suggest once you start looking at the structural assessment side, you really want some structural engineering horsepower, and in some cases quite a lot, to really understand what that's about. So hopefully that covers the question, but happy to take further if we need to.
Awesome, thanks for that, Tim. Yeah, that was some great information. I guess, yeah, if that doesn't cover that question off completely, feel free to put through another question. We might try and answer that offline a bit. Yeah. Isabella, any other questions that have come through?
Thanks, Kieran. We've got one more question from Jeff, and they have asked, does the AADT take account of all vehicles irrespective of size, or does it use the so-called PVE ratios adopted by MRWA?
So if we're talking about general AADT, it usually does take into account heavy vehicles. I don't think it takes into account what type it is, unless you do use a passenger car equivalent. And there are certain parts in the guide where it does ask you to use a passenger car equivalent. Typically, your AADT will be kind of broken up into different percentages of heavy vehicle types, though. Dave, I don't know if you want to add any extra information on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, as you mentioned, there are certain activities, well, assessment attributes that you would consider the passenger vehicle equivalents, and that's just to account for the size of the vehicle. And an example of that is with overtaking. So the longer they're taking up more capacity on the road because of their length. If the question's related to pavements or structures, we've got an example coming up soon where it shows how we handle that with pavements. And with structures, you're predominantly looking at the heavy vehicles. I don't know, Tim, if you want to add anything onto that, whether you actually take into account total vehicle volumes, or whether you're really only just looking at the heavy vehicle because it's the only thing that has an influence on the structure.
Certainly from a you know, assessment point of view, we're really only interested in the heavies. And even as a structural engineer, funnily enough, we probably get more excited about pedestrian loading than we do car loading. If we have a bridge that's got potential for significant pedestrian loading, but yeah, pretty much it's the heavies. And when we're looking at the structural side, it's not just you know, that they're a heavy vehicle. We start to get a bit interested in particularly their configuration and mass distribution, because the tension between allowing access and protecting your assets is a little bit like what I was talking about with the difference between heavy vehicle assessment and structural assessment. So to get productivity, we want the vehicles to be short, fast and heavy, and to protect the assets, we want them to be long, slow and light. And so the question becomes, where do you kind of set that point? And certainly from a bridges point of view, We're primarily interested in the mass and distribution of that mass, and to some extent speed as well.
Awesome, thanks guys. All right, well, we might move into this, into an example that oh, not an example yet, sorry. We'll move into the pavement side of things now. And like I said before, we've got a couple more questions, slides coming up, so feel free to keep throwing questions in. So yeah, like I mentioned, we've provided some more information in the guidelines, specifically around the pavement assessment. Before we go jumping into the pavement assessment section, we've got a couple of notes here. So firstly, the guide uses the application of standard axle repetitions from the Austroads Guide to Pavement Technology, Part 2, 2012. So I think now there's some newer guides out there. I think at the time of writing this, that was the newest one that was there. Secondly, this guide uses marginal costs calculated by TMR. So currently, unsealed roads haven't been determined by TMR. However, councils can still calculate their own marginal cost rates and undertake an assessment on unsealed roads using the same process. It's just subbing in different marginal costs. That's the only difference, and you'll see more of that later, and we'll explain it a little bit more in detail. At the end of this section, we also do have a bit of an example on how to use those or the pavement assessment framework to some degree. All right, so obviously when assessing heavy vehicles, it's critical to consider the pavement damage and wear due to the increased heavy vehicle volume and also the mass of those vehicles. So the guideline provides a broad pavement impact assessment process that can be adopted by local governments. And it's typically comparing the road user demand against the current capacity of the route. So we've got a bit of a flow chart there on the right that kind of helps you to determine which way you go on that. The main one is whether your demand is less than or greater than your capacity. And based on that answer, yeah, you can either calculate the impact with marginal cost principles or calculate cost to satisfy your demand. So in the pavement assessment part, so I guess there's two common methods of calculating the remaining life of a pavement. So these are the empirical method and the mechanical method. So the empirical method uses design charts for overlays from the Austroads manual, and the mechanical method uses back calculating the moduli of the pavement layers. So both methods are usable, and both methods require the following data. So pavement strength data, traffic data, and pavement configuration and thicknesses. So this is just providing a little bit of background information on the pavement analysis process. So we've also got some guidance around the marginal cost principles. So pavement impacts can be expressed with marginal cost principles and is widely accepted as a reasonable basis for cost attribution. So we've got a bit of an example on the right there, and this is also from the guide. So this is looking at freight tasks at GML or general mass limits, and then also an additional freight task of general mass limits plus 10%. So as you can see in the graph there on the right, it brings forward the rehabilitation works by up to 6 years. So there is like a difference there, and you do need to account for that. So the marginal cost of road wear is the difference in the cost of maintaining a road arising from an increase in traffic loading above the current or base traffic. So your marginal cost will be different based on the pavement base and also your traffic classification. So in the TMR marginal cost calculations, they've already determined it for 3 types of pavement. So you got asphalt pavement base. So you've got asphalt, granular pavements, and cement stabilized. And then also 4 different traffic classifications. So less than 1,500, 5,000 to 10,000. Oh, sorry, less than 1,500, 1,500 to 5,000, 5,000, 10,000, and greater than 10,000. So we've provided a bit of an example of that on the right there in the figure, and this again is included in the guidelines. So you can see that certain types of pavement base layers result in higher marginal costs, whilst others are a lot lower. And then you can also see that there's very high marginal costs for low traffic levels, which kind of indicates that that is most likely a rural road. And it's really not designed to carry heavy vehicles. So that's why there is that quite a high marginal cost. And just as a note, marginal cost is calculated as cents per standard axle repetition kilometre. I believe I've got that right. I think I've got it written down somewhere else, so I can double check that. So we just mentioned standard axle repetition. So the load on the pavement can be expressed as the number of standard axle repetitions caused by a heavy vehicle. So you can convert the axle groups on the heavy vehicle into axle repetitions that would be made by, say, a passenger vehicle. So this SAR value allows the freight task to be expressed as a ratio of the freight load to the standard load per axle. And the load damage exponent is based on the pavement type. So we've got an example of this coming up soon, but in the top right there, so we've got the formula on how to calculate SAR, and then we've got a few tables at the bottom here. So the table on the bottom right, so this is the loads on axle groups, which cause the same damage as a standard axle. So that's your standard load. And then on the bottom right, on the bottom left, sorry, this is the load damage exponent. So it's the amount of damage that's caused on the different types of pavement, really. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the example that's coming up. So again, this marginal cost principle. So the impact on the pavement in terms of marginal cost can be calculated using the formula on the right there. So again, this is included in the guidelines. And this is calculated for each road segment within a route. So the marginal cost essentially shows the annual additional cost in maintenance and can be used to determine the additional cost for new vehicles and compare additional costs for different vehicle types. So first of all, we've got the formula in there on the top right. It's a bit of a long formula, I know. We've got an example of how to apply that coming up in a second. And then in the bottom right, so this is the TMR 2017 marginal cost database. So TMR's actually calculated marginal costs for all their districts and put that into the appendix of this guide. So you can easily get a marginal cost rate. Otherwise, you can actually calculate your own. And as I said earlier, this is only for sealed roads. So if you do want to do this for an unsealed road, you can manually calculate the marginal cost and then apply that in the same process. All right, I will just open up for a couple of questions before we move on to the example. So Isabella, maybe just 1 or 2 questions before we go on.
Sounds good, thank you. We've got one from Nicholas, and they have asked, some operators have recently referenced an Australian Trucking Association truck impact chart, which indicates that the implementation of road-friendly suspensions, ESAs, are reduced, i.e. a B-double at GML would have the same ESAs as a B-double at HML with additional road-friendly suspension. Have you come across this? I would have thought based on how ESAs are calculated, this would be incorrect. Please comment.
I think I actually have seen that impact chart, but I haven't really taken the time to study it very well, so I can't really provide too much comment on that. Laurie, I don't know if you've seen that or not, or if you can provide some comment around that.
Kieran, like yourself, I've heard of it, but I've actually haven't come across and see it, and will be able to make meaningful comments on that question. So we'll probably have to get back to him on that one.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, we'll try and answer that question after the webinar.
Yeah, Kieran, I just wonder, Larry, have you come across that conversation before?
Yes, there was a project done many years ago, talking about decades ago, called the Divine Project, which actually looked at the effect that load-friendly suspension could have on the damage done to the roads by heavy vehicles. I'm just delving through all of my paperwork on my desk to try to find a copy of that that report, but it's also something we'll have to get back to you on.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And if my memory serves me correctly, Arbor's also had a look at airbag suspension and some of the benefits it has as well for TMR. So we can certainly pull together some information and pass it on. And I mean, ultimately, it's up to the road manager to accept any assumptions made by that, and then evidence of the vehicle having that suspension, and perhaps that vehicle may be able to be run under a permit.
Yep.
Yeah, just for it's Larry here again. Just for what it's worth, I've dug up the report on the on the Divine Project. So it was dynamic interaction between vehicles and infrastructure experiment. That's where Divine came from, and it's October 1998. So it does go back a few years, but we're going to have to delve into that a little bit more seriously.
Thanks, Larry.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry.
Thanks, Kieran. We currently don't have any more questions for the time being, so we should keep moving.
All right, perfect. All right, so we're just going to jump into an example of that pavement assessment process, mainly around the calculation of SAR for proposed heavy vehicle types, and then the assessment of the marginal cost for those heavy vehicles. And then right at the end, we'll look at a comparison of a proposed prescriptive heavy vehicle and then a PBS heavy vehicle. So I think in this case, I believe I've got a 26 meter B double versus a PBS level 2B A double vehicle. Yeah. All right, so for this example, like I said, we're going to look at this 9-axle B double operating at general mass limits. So in this example, we're basically, I guess, undertaking the assessment that a local government may undertake. So if they were to receive an application for a permit or want to provide network access, then this is kind of a similar process to what they would do. So the first thing that we would really need to do is kind of work out what the vehicle is, what the impacts of that vehicle is, how many, what the travel number is of that vehicle. So in the bottom left here, so we've estimated the number of daily trips. So this can either come from our estimations, or we could ask the applicant how many times they plan on traveling per day or per week. So for now, we're using an estimation of 60 daily trips. And then the number of operating weeks in the year is 336. So they're operating 48 weeks a year, 7 days a week. And they've requested access for a 10-kilometre section of a granular pavement in this council area. So on the right there, we've also determined what type of vehicle this is. So we've got our 9-axle B double at the top there. And then we've also determined what our axle loads are. So this is the typical single steer axle with a tandem axle dual tire as the drive. And then we've got 2 triaxle dual tire axle groups. So we've also just chucked in what the mass would be on there. So this is just a GML, so it's 6 tons, 16.5, 20 and 20. And then we've got our standard loads and our actual loads that we've calculated from some of the tables, and we'll go into that a little bit more detail in a second. Yeah, so the first thing we really need to do is go and calculate what our SAR is, so our standard axle repetitions. So again, this can be calculated using equation, I believe it's 3 from the guide, and we can get our standard loads and our actual loads for the vehicles from tables 13.1 and 13.2 from the guide. So I believe the table 13.2, that only works if we're looking at GML vehicles. If you're looking at HML vehicles, then you just need to calculate what the load is in kilonewtons. So it's basically just the tonnage multiplied by 9.81, which is gravity. And then our magnitude exponent can be found in table 13.3. So this is essentially, I think I didn't have it back there. So this is the dependent on what type of pavement base we've got. So in this case, we're using granular pavement, so we get a magnitude exponent of 4. So in the top right here, we're calculating what the SAR is for each of our axle groups. So again, we've got the single axle, single tire group, the tandem axle, dual tire, and then the 2 tri-axle dual tire groups. So we've basically just grabbed the standard loads and the actual loads from tables 13.1, 13.2, plugged them into this formula, and then added our magnitude exponent from table 13.3. So for the very first one, so a single axle, single tire, so it's 59 divided by 53 to the power of 4. And then that basically gives us 1.54 standard axle repetitions. And then we've done that for each of our groups. And then our total standard axle repetitions for the 9-axle B double is 6.37. So it's a relatively straightforward process once you've kind of done it once or twice. And then we can move on to what our marginal cost rates are. So the marginal cost rates, which is cents per SAR per kilometre, for each TMR district can be found in the guide. So there's 2 tables in the guide. So one which you can use to determine which TMR district you're in. So that's the example in the top right there. So for this example, we're going to be using Logan City Council as a bit of an example, just so that we can get a general marginal cost rate to use. So we look up Logan City in the table D.7, and then we can find out that our TMR district number is 410, or we're in the South Coast region or South Coast district. And then we can use table D.6 to actually work out what our marginal cost rate is, or marginal cost. So like I said before, we're going to use Logan City Council as a bit of an example here. We've got that granular road still, and our AADT is less than 1500. So if we use the table on the bottom right and kind of follow that through to work out our marginal cost, we find that the cost is 8.5 cents per SAR per kilometre. So that's the value that we're going to use in our example. And then finally, we can calculate the marginal cost using equation 4 from the guide. So that's the equation on the right there. And we're going to use the parameters that we identified earlier. So we've got our daily trips, which was 60, our yearly operating days, which was 336. Our route segment was 10 kilometers. Our vehicle SAR was 6.37, and our marginal cost rate was 8.5. So on the right, we can see that we've plugged those values into the formula. And again, you do have to do this calculation for each road segment. So we've plugged those in, and we've determined that our pavement contribution is $109,156.30. So that's our annual maintenance increase. So if we were to grant access to these types of vehicles, then that's how much impact it would have, how much our annual maintenance would increase, essentially. So the second part of this example is mainly going to look at a comparison of estimated annual maintenance of a route for a prescriptive vehicle versus a PBS vehicle. And we've actually got technically three examples here. So we're looking at a 9-axle B double, so the same one that we were looking at previously. And then we've got a PBS 11-axle A double, which is kind of operating at a bit of a restricted mass. So it's operating at 68 tons, the same as the 9-axle B double. And then finally, we've got the PBS 11-axle A double operating at its full mass, general mass limit, which is actually 79 tons. And then we can also see that the B double, so freight-wise, it's able to carry a 20-foot and a 40-foot container, whilst the A double is able to carry two 40-foot containers. So there is that difference. And then on the right, we've just gone through and we've looked at the axle loads and what their standard loads are and what their actual loads are based on the tables in the guide. So we're just going to essentially repeat that same process that we did previously. So we're going to calculate our standard axle repetitions. So I've omitted the calculations in here and just provided what the SARs are and what the total is. So for our 9-axle B double, so now we've got a total of 8.323. Our PBS 2B 11-axle A double at that restricted mass was 5.118. And then the full mass A double is 8.433. So now we're able to go through and calculate what our marginal cost is for these vehicles. So we're still using the same parameters that we used in that last example. So same daily trips, same yearly operating days, route segment, and the marginal cost. And then we can use that same marginal cost rate calculation to determine how much the additional annual maintenance cost is. So we've got those marked in that dark blue box there. So again, the 9-axle B double, $142,614. The PBS at restricted mass is about 87,000, and then the PBS at full mass is 144,000. And then on the right, we've got a maintenance saving compared to the B double. So you can see that the second one down, so the restricted mass PBS vehicle, actually technically saves us about $55,000 because it's distributing that mass across a lot more axles. Whilst the full mass vehicle, it actually increases the cost by about $2,000. And you'll also see some little red asterisks there. So what this is it doesn't consider the freight efficiency and that less trips are likely to be used when that vehicle is operating at that full mass. So if it's operating at that additional mass, then yeah, you're likely to require less trips to transfer the same amount of goods. So what we do then is we then work out what the difference is in trips per year. So yeah, like I said before, the larger vehicle may carry more goods by volume or mass, leading to a reduction in trips. So as an example here, we're saying that the trips that are required are reduced to 40 daily trips, and the yearly operating days is still 336. And then we calculate what our annual maintenance costs are based on that. So in that table on the bottom there, we see that we've now got trips per year. So for the B double vehicle, we've got about 20,000 trips per year because it's operating 60 daily trips per year for 336 days. However, the PBS vehicle, in the case of the restricted mass, where it's operating at that same mass, it could be that volumetrically it could carry more products or goods. So the daily trips has reduced to 40, resulting in only about 14,000 trips instead. And then in the example of the full mass PBS vehicle, it's just carrying more mass than the other one. So there's a reduction in trips to 40 daily trips, also around 14,000. So all the SARs and the marginal cost rates all stay the same. Length still stays the same. And then we look at the actual comparison in costs. So now we're looking at a additional annual maintenance cost for the restricted mass vehicle of about 59,000. So that's actually about 54,000 less than what we estimated previously. And then the full mass vehicle is now 96,000. So that's 46,000 less compared to previously. And then in brackets, it just shows what the saving was based on the previous assessment. So because those vehicles are now having less travel, less trips, we're actually at a net benefit. And I'll just jump back to this one so that we can kind of see that. So originally, yeah, 87,000 and 145,000, and now we're looking at 59,000 and 96,000. So yeah, that's how you would go through and use that that SAR and the marginal cost to kind of calculate what the difference would be between that prescriptive vehicle and the PBS equivalent, or even just to work out what the additional cost would be if you're just adding a new vehicle type. All right. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the webinar. So I'll just open up for a couple of questions before we finish off. Isabella, any questions that have come through?
Thanks, Kieran. We have a question from Mike, and they have asked, the number of trips is not always available in NHVR. Does this make this process null and void if the number of trips is not available?
A little bit, yeah. So you are able to ask applicants how many trips they would be making, especially if it is a application for a permit rather than application for, say, a network. So it is possible to actually go back and request that information so you can run that permit, so you can run that pavement assessment. However, yeah, without the number of trips, it is difficult to undertake the SAR marginal cost analysis. Yeah. And I don't know if Laurie wants to add anything on that. I think that kind of covered it.
Kieran, I might just add that you can get your initial breakdown of traffic and number of trips from your traffic counts. So if you're not already getting the information, you might be getting a heavy vehicle percentage of the total ADT, but you can also request to have it by vehicle classification. It won't identify what the proportion of say a class 10 vehicle is PBS or non-PBS, but it's a good starting point. And then as Kieran mentioned, in your permit, if you are giving access based on the freight task, the same freight task being achieved with less vehicle movements based on giving access to higher productivity vehicles, then yes, if you run that under a permit and then monitor the traffic counts, because you'll know the before and after, you can start to have conversations with that freight provider as to whether they're adhering to their permit conditions.
Yeah, and that is a good
Larry,
point.
Yeah, and once you start to, there's also ITS monitoring and some other systems that are in place, not necessarily for some of the lower order regional rural roads, but some of the higher order local government roads. That's a consideration to manage vehicle movements on your network. Larry, did you want to provide any input as to how TMR is managing this?
Well, I'm not actually aware that you can put a limitation on the number of vehicles. So yes,
Yeah.
what you're saying about checking before and then after will give you an idea of the amount of load, the volume of these vehicles that are going through and the load that they're putting onto the pavements. But I'm not certain that there's very much that you can do about it.
Yeah, so there is the possibility to actually apply a trip limit in a NACE permit. It is kind of like a little bit hard to enforce that unless you want to go through the route of requesting freight manifests from operators, but it is possible to actually apply those limits. And I have seen that done in the past where local governments kind of want to track the pavement deterioration.
Yes, and then there's the other thing. Somebody else comes up with an identical vehicle wanting to go along that route. And that will obviously add to the number of vehicles of this type going along that route. How do you say, no, we've already accepted the maximum amount that we are prepared to have along that route?
Yeah.
It becomes a very awkward thing to argue.
Yeah, that does kind of like cause a bit of a tricky situation. I'm not too sure what the answer is on that one. I guess it's a matter of simply stating that the pavement cannot accommodate any more vehicles of that type.
Yeah, it's one of those higher level sort of policy decisions where, as the road manager, you need to have a firm position as to whether you're providing access to someone and accepting additional costs, or whether you see that a particular route as a high productivity route, which is moving more freight around, which has economic benefits to the region. If you go along that approach and recognise that the road will deteriorate and need additional funds, that's a standpoint that you need to have, where those freight providers either contribute to that, or you're accepting that you're identifying a particular road to provide and to assist in that freight task, so that you would then have to start to put more funds into that road as a road manager. So there's no single answer for that, really. It just depends on the situation.
Any other questions, Isabella?
Yeah, we've got another one from Paul, and they have asked, how do you determine from the traffic counts the vehicles from each company?
So yeah, that one you won't be able to do. The vehicle count simply says how many vehicles there are. It doesn't say what company it's from or anything like that. If you do want to kind of find that information, you'd really have to contact the freight company themselves to find out how many trips they've made or how many vehicles they have in operation on that road.
Yep, and for the higher order roads, there are ITS systems which you use with number plate recognition and other forms of visual recognition, so you can identify who your road users are. It really just depends on what it is that you're trying to manage and how high you prioritize getting that information and engaging with the freight operators. It's not a slap on the wrist. It's a partnership. We have to move freight around the country. We're trying to do so using lower order roads, and we need to find some sort of balance there.
Thanks, Dave. Any other questions that come through? Otherwise, yeah, we might have to wrap it up soon.
Yeah, we've probably got time for one last question, and this has come through from Mohammed, and they have asked whether ESA is the same as SRAs. What are the factors that has to be considered in the weigh in motion weigh bridges in pavement deterioration calculations?
Yeah, so that's one that I'm going to have to pass on to Laurie. Laurie, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks for the question, Mohammed. So as Kieran noted there, during the time we are putting this together, we still make reference to the old Austroad's Guides to Pavement Technologies, Part 2, 2012, and during which time, some of you guys might be familiar with this, the loading from traffic was calculated based on the SAR. So the ESA equivalent to SAR is the ESA 4. SAR 4 is equivalent to ESA, to put it simply. And since then, there has been obviously an updated in the way we're calculating or design our pavements, but we just haven't had a time to reconcile the new guide in pavement designs and how we actually calculating the SARs and the marginal costs, to put it simply. I might just add that since the development of this guide, we're leveraging the other projects in NACOE, as you know, and there's been some works done on the unsealed road space. So TMR now have done something similar to the sealed road networks by means of developing a database for marginal cost for unsealed network. I think it's available for public if you ask through TMR road asset data channel. The other thing that you want to know is the availability of they produce a guide to traffic impact assessment. This was also new, probably 2 years old, but it was intended for use for TMR network. So those are the two updates in this area.
Awesome, thanks, Laurie.
Thanks, Kieran. I think our time is up, so if we could move on to the next slide, please.
Yep.
Perfect. So thank you to our presenters today, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. This is the last of this NACOE series. However, please check out our website. We have so much happening in the online space, and we'd love to have you join us with anything that might enhance your professional development and build your CPD points. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Isabella. And yeah, like always, I just want to thank all of our guest panelists, Laurie, Dave, Tim, Larry. Yeah, it's great having you in here.
Thanks, Kieran. It's a pleasure. And look, just from the NACOE ARB and TMR side, thanks to all the attendees for tuning in on the 5-part series. It is a long haul. There is a lot of information in the guide, and we hope that you can use that to undertake the most robust assessment as possible. And on the nacoe.com.au, where you can download the guide, there should be an email in there that you can shoot questions through to us for ongoing support. So we can provide that. So please be in touch.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.